Peter Charles here, Hooked for Life Fly Fishing. And in my last video, I talked about comparing a mono running line to coated running line and the benefits and the drawbacks of each. And I've talked about shooting line in quite a few of the videos and showed examples of it. I thought it'd be a good idea to talk about the issues that impact our ability to shoot line very well or not well, and some things to consider, because if we can handle a certain distance and a certain amount of running line in one condition, we may not be able to handle it in another. And so I don't think we should be too hard on ourselves if all of a sudden we can't handle a lot of running line and we think there's something wrong, and it may be just the conditions. So I've got some footage here, and we've seen this one before. I had a lot of mono running line off the reel. It's very light running line, and I'm wading ankle deep. Now this one is different. I'm wading waist deep, and I had to pull the head right into the guides. I mean, the back taper was actually touching the water. It's a 60-foot head, 61-foot head with a 10-foot pulley leader. So I still had, if you include the pulley leader, 50-something feet out of the guides, plus the leader in front of that. So I was managing a lot, but I was waist deep. The current was relatively strong, I was concentrating on keeping my balance more than anything else. So I wasn't shooting very much at all. And that, I had to live with that. I mean, I was getting about a 90-foot cast in total. It's a big run, and I had to live with it. There's no way I was going to get more, considering how deep I was and how I had to concentrate on, just the lift and keeping my balance. So, I mean, in those conditions, I wasn't getting very much distance at all. Compared to this one where I'm ankle deep and I was able to cast quite far. Both these examples, the running line was quite thick, especially in the one with the 61-foot head with the yellow line. That was a Airflow Delta 2. The running line on that line is quite thick, so it means it's heavy, which means it doesn't shoot as well. This line, the running line was fairly thick on it as well, but I'm ankle deep. It's much easier to get a good cast off. I'm using a longer rod. Previous one was 13.5. This one is 15. So it just made it easier to lift line and shoot line. Longer rod, wading ankle deep, skinnier running line. And of course, I shot about 45 foot of running line on this one. Versus the other one where I barely shot any. I shot maybe a rod length's worth, and that was about it. So, different scenarios. This is an 85-foot head. The other one's a 61-foot head plus 10-foot pulley leader. And yet I'm getting more distance out of the 85-foot head simply because of the situation. So, as I say, there's an example of don't beat yourself up. If you're wading deep, tricky conditions, thick running line, you may not be able to get much distance out of it. And then that's, the way it is. So here's another example. You've seen this one many times. This is fairly skinny coated running line, ankle deep, very, very easy. So let's look at the issues here. So for the same rod, so we'll keep that the same. Obviously, longer rods work better. But for the same rod, your shoot's going to be affected by the thickness, the weight, and type of the running line. So thick versus thin, mono versus coated. The skinnier and the lighter the running line, the better it will shoot. Quite simply that. The heavier and thicker it is, the less shoot you get. There's not only more weight to pull through the guides, there's more drag in the guides, and there's more drag on the water with a thick running line. Your height. I'm a short guy and I'm wading deep. There's not a lot of me out of the water. And if I'm not using a long rod, I'm going to have some issues. So your height and how deep you are wading or how shallow you're wading has a big impact on how much line you can lift comfortably and then how much line you'll be able to shoot. Because the other problem, which doesn't get appreciated, is that when you are controlling your running line, and like you've got running line in your lower hand, when you're close to the water, that bottom hand is very close to the water when you're wading deep. So a lot of the running line is on the water, and only a little bit of it's in the air. So there's a lot of water drag when you're wading deep versus when you're wading shallow. When you've seen my examples of where I'm wading shallow, there's not a lot of running line touching the water. Most of the running line's in the air. That reverses when you're wading deep. Most of the running line is now on the water and only a little bit of it is in the air. It really has a major impact on the amount you can shoot. So not only is your lift affected, but your shoot is affected simply by being deeper in the water. The surface you're coming off of makes a difference. If you've got a stripping basket or if you're fishing off of a boat, you'll be able to cast a lot further than when you're wading, simply because the line is coming off of a hard surface with virtually no drag. And away it goes. I mean, I use a stripping basket in Cape Cod. No problems casting over 100 foot with a single hand rod because I'm using a stripping basket. If it was coming off the water, it wouldn't be anywhere near as much. So the surface you're on does make a difference. And in one of my videos, you saw me casting off of a rock, and my running line was on the rock. That made a big difference as well. I was able to get some considerable distance because my running line was coming off of a rock, not off the water. Current speed has an effect as well, because the faster the current, the more the line is being pulled out and the less of the line is in contact with the water. In contrast, if you were standing in frog water, all your running line would be sitting on it, and some of it would actually sink a little bit. There'd be a lot more water drag coming off of frog water than coming off of fast water. So if you're able to stand in faster current ankle deep, you're going to get better shoot, as you've seen in my examples, simply because so little of the running line is actually touching the water. So you have less water drag on the running line. Something we don't think about, but you can get sinking running lines. And in Cape Cod, when I'm fishing for striped bass, my running lines are intermediates. Intermediate shoots better than the floater, everything else being the same. So if you've got a 30-pound core in both, the floater doesn't go as far because it is fatter. Maybe the same weight, but it's fatter. It has a lower density, so it has more aerodynamic drag. So it doesn't shoot as far. It's more affected by the wind and all that sort of thing. So sinking running lines work great off of hard surfaces like a boat deck or stripping basket. They're terrible in water unless you've got fast current because they sink. And so you end up with your running line tangled on sticks and weeds and everything else that's on the bottom. And only if you've got a really fast current where it will pull the sinking running line out, and so only a little bit's touching the water. Except for that situation, you don't want to be using a sinking running line when you're wading. It's just bad news. Okay, here's an interesting one which most of us don't think about, and that's stripping guide placement. This only really happens when you've got a rod perhaps made in the UK versus one that's made in North America. What you see is if you're looking at a rod, of course I've cut this off, but imagine this being a standard length butt section for a 4-piece rod. If it was a UK rod, you might see the stripping guide on the butt section, and you'd almost never see that on a North American built rod. If we're talking single-handers and you're talking freshwater versus saltwater, you might see that stripper guide on the saltwater rod being moved further ahead. And where on the freshwater rod, it's further back. And the reason for that is the further ahead that you put that stripping guide, it produces slightly less drag on the chute because the running line is going through less of a sharp angle as it comes out of a stripping basket, off of a boat deck, whatever. You tend to have a little bit less angle, and you've also got usually a bigger stripping guide to allow the chute to go better. So your guides will have a small impact, and the guide placement, the size of the guides, will affect a little bit the chute. So if you have a trout rod that's built for accuracy, casting relatively short distances, and you need to go along with it, the guides on that rod will probably impact the distance versus the same rod in a saltwater configuration. So there is some, if you are, keyed in on distance, pay attention to the guides on the rod when you're buying it, because some rods are just not an important consideration. And when I'm talking about those UK rods, they're built for lifting line as opposed to shooting line. The North American rods tend to be built more for shooting line, and so true also of Scandinavian rods. They're built for shooting line, so that accounts for your difference in your stripper guide location. And also you might see a difference in the guide size as well. Another thing is how efficient are we at handling the running line? It's worth learning to handle running line efficiently, which is being able to use your fingers to hold running line and keep it nice and straight in the water, avoiding twists and tangles, which make a mess of things. So those things to go together, efficient handling and avoiding twists and tangles. The twists in your line often come from bad casting. So if you can cast more cleanly, you'll end up with less twists and you'll end up with less tangles. So there's something to work on, being able to manage your running line, get nice, neat, straight loops that lay in the water nice and neatly, and they will come off cleanly with less interference and less likelihood of tangles. So the bottom line is with this is that depending on your situation, the type of running line you have, and other considerations like the type of surface you're on, you are going to get a big difference in how much line you can shoot. And you may not be able to shoot very much wading deep with a thick running line, for example, with a short rod. You may not be able to cast very far, and that's just what you're going to have to live with. So, it's important that we don't try to beat ourselves up if, we're not able to cast very far because of the conditions and because of the amount of line we are actually able to shoot. And ideal, I'm showing you a lot of ideal situations in my videos here, but sometimes I'm getting into situations that are far less than ideal, and I'm not getting it anywhere near the distance I would get in better conditions. So, as I say, it's something to keep in mind that we don't always think that we're going to get the same distance all the time, no matter what we're doing. So keep that in mind when you're out there and you're starting to struggle for distance and you're starting to get a little frustrated. Maybe that's the best you can expect under the conditions. So keep that in mind. Cheers.